Good day, everybody. It's John Norright here again at the University of Sydney. And today I want to talk to you about why there are four football codes in Australia more than any other developed country. So in Australia, we have four professional commercialized football codes. We have Australian rules football, which is unique to Australia and a few other countries, founded here and played here. Secondly, we have rugby union football. Thirdly, we have rugby league football. And fourth, we have association football or soccer, which is the game played around the world. So how did this happen, and why is Australia unique in this respect? Well, back in the middle of the 19th century, modern sport was created out of rules played at English public schools and at Oxford and Cambridge, the main universities in England. And each public school had its own code of football that resembled or evolved from folk football, which had a myriad of rules, different villages. There was no one set. So each school developed its own rules for its game. Schools like Eton, Harrow, Winchester, Rugby School. Rugby you may recognize because two of those codes have rugby in their name. So how did they get formed and how did they get to Australia? Well, about the same time in the 1840s and 50s, Australia was beginning to emerge as a vibrant economy and colony within the British Empire. In 1852, there was a big gold rush after the gold rush in San Francisco area in California. Many people came out to Ballarat in Victoria and the colony that ended up with Melbourne as its largest city. Melbourne grew tremendously from nothing in 1850 to be a vibrant, thriving city by 1860. During the 1850s, many of the schools that were formed in Melbourne had people coming out from England to staff those schools. They didn't have one football code that they really agreed on, but the weather in Melbourne can be really bad. They've called it a place that has four seasons in one day. And in Melbourne, they had cricket grounds, which are played on large ovals, if you've seen cricket played. If you haven't, it's a huge field, maybe 220 meters by 160 meters across. What to do in wintertime when the weather was too bad for them to play cricket. So they relied on the football games that they knew, and they came up in 1858 with a set of rules that became Melbourne rules, later Victorian rules, and now Australian rules football. And that developed in Melbourne. But at a similar time, many people who had experience of rugby school and schools influenced by rugby, such as Uppingham School, where Edward Thring was the headmaster, developed a rugby playing culture in Sydney, even before the rules of rugby were codified. Meanwhile, back in England in 1863, a bunch of old schoolboys got together and formed the Football Association to create association football, which is also known as soccer. However, the people who were from rugby school and who played a rugby form of football did not want to join that league because of the issue of hacking, whereby they could kick players in the shins to stop them from advancing the ball or to try to tackle them. And so the rugby guys wanted hacking, the football guys didn't. So in 1871, all of the clubs and schools that adhered to rugby created the Rugby Football Union with its own rules, which allowed carrying of the ball. That game, rugby union, became predominant in Sydney and also in Brisbane and Queensland. So rugby became the dominant game in New South Wales and Queensland, while in the southern states, with closer relationships to Melbourne, Adelaide, Perth, the large cities, Hobart, in South Australia, Western Australia, and Tasmania, developed Australian rules football as their primary winter code. So that's two down, and then a partial story on soccer. So how did rugby league emerge? In England in 1895, there were a lot of players who started taking up the game in the north of England who also worked for a living, worked in factories in the towns. And when they got injured, they were unable to work as well. So they wanted broken time payments, which meant basically workman's compensation for while they were out on injury. So they proposed this to the rugby union, who said, no, that is professionalism, we won't allow it. So this group met in Leeds and broke away to form the Northern Rugby Football Union in 1895. In 1908, Australia undertook its first rugby union tour of the British Isles and met with some of the players and officials. The officials kind of frowned upon it, but some of the players met with rugby league clubs and players in the north of England and brought rugby league back to Sydney. And soon after, a number of clubs began playing the sport of rugby league. The difference between rugby union and rugby league really comes down to a couple of key points. One is in rugby union, there are 15 players a side in the main predominant game of rugby. In rugby league, there are 13 players a side. Another key difference in rugby union is the play keeps going as long as the team with the ball retains possession. In rugby league, when you're tackled, you have to stop the defense, reset, and the ball is heeled back to restart play. And you get 6 tackles in which to score. So many clubs, if they don't score after the 5th tackle, pass it back and kick to the other team. So that's a little bit different from the rules in rugby union. And there are several others that you'll notice as you watch each of the 2 games, either live, if you're able to do our course at the University of Sydney, or through virtual reality, streaming, or television. Finally, soccer. Soccer was identified as kind of an international game very quickly at the time that rugby, Australian rules football, rugby league were emerging as significant sports in Australia. Australian rules and then later rugby league developed professional competitions. And all of those games began to be identified with what it means to be an Australian. Soccer, on the other hand, was seen more as a broad game that was played everywhere. And initially, many British migrants who stayed with soccer were kind of seen to not be kind of joining in Australian culture. Then after World War II, there were a number of immigrants who came to Australia, particularly from Southern and Eastern Europe, who began to found their own soccer clubs because they had played back home. So you have clubs like Marconi, Hellenic, Sydney, Croatia, Serbian clubs. So clubs that were identified with a particular region. And these clubs were really important for maintaining identity and also transitioning into Australian society. And you'll find that a number of athletes who played soccer, their children and grandchildren may play other codes, such as Australian football or rugby league or rugby union. In the 1990s, this became a real issue of having ethnically aligned clubs, particularly as the former Yugoslavia broke up. And so there were a number of violent incidents that took place, particularly when Croatian and Serbian clubs played each other. And in 2003, there was a report to basically say that the problems in Australian football, soccer were related to ethnic tensions, and the best way forward was to de-ethnicize clubs, focus on place and on brand or mascot name. And so what you see today is clubs like Sydney City Football Club, which has the Opera House as its kind of main logo. Melbourne Victory, Perth Glory, Brisbane Roar, Melbourne City, which is part of the City Football Group that owns Manchester City and New York City, amongst other clubs, all playing in the league in a professional and commercialized format. So each of those 4 codes has a great following, although Australian rules football, the Australian Football League in particular, is the most popular. It's the 4th largest attended football league in the world in terms of average attendance, after the NFL, the Bundesliga in Germany, and the Premier League in England. So each of these codes have following where they can attract 25, 30, 40,000 to a match, all the way up to the grand final in Australian football, which attracts a sellout crowd of over 98,000 to the Melbourne Cricket Ground, where the final is typically held. So that's an overview of how and why Australia emerged with 4 football codes, each of which are worth experiencing when you're in Australia, and each one has different cultures and different followings. Thank you very much.